Welcome to the History of the Papacy podcast, a podcast about the history of the popes of Rome and Christian Church. Prepare yourself to step behind the ropes and leave the official tour of the story of the popes and Christianity. I am your host, Steve Guerra, and I thank you for joining me on this journey. You can find show notes, how to contact me, sign up for our mailing list, and how to support the History of the Papacy by going to our website, a2zhistorypage.com. Two great ways to support the History of the Papacy are leaving your ratings and reviews on Apple Podcasts or your podcatcher of choice. And another really great way to support the History of the Papacy is by going and joining us on Patreon at patreon.com/History of the Papacy. Your support on Patreon goes a long way to help keep the History of the Papacy sustainable for a long time in the future. There are 4 tiers of support on Patreon: Antioch, Alexandria, Constantinople, and Rome. Each of these tiers represents one of the traditional patriarchates of early Christianity. There are many great benefits to you for supporting the show on Patreon. You will receive early and advertisement-free content, bonus episodes, monthly book drawings, and most importantly, you will be included on the History of the Papacy diptychs. In traditional Christianity, the diptychs are the lists of bishops commemorated in order of their precedence. The sooner you sign up on Patreon, the higher you'll be on the lists of the History of the Papacy patrons. Now let us commemorate the Patreon patrons on the History of the Papacy diptychs. We have Roberto, Yoren, William B., Brian, Jeffrey, Christina, John, Sarah, William H., and Judy at the Alexandria level. We have Doppo, Paul, Justin, Lana, John, Steve, and Sean, all of whom are magnificent at the Constantinople level and reaching that ultimate power and prestige, that of the See of Rome. We have Peter the Great, Alex the Great, Amma the Great, Frederick the Great, and Jeffrey the Great. And with that, here is the next piece of the mosaic of the history of the popes of Rome and Christian Church. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to say, and I think the people would probably push back that look at how much evil stuff happened, the Crusades and stuff like that, but look at how much devastation happened in the 20th century, just a couple of years. Nietzsche dies in 1900, and you basically have a mass murder on a scale that this has never happened in humanity for about the 50 years afterwards.
Yeah, that's a great point people love to point out, is say, look at the atrocities in the name of Christianity. And yes, there have been atrocities in the name of Christianity, but it doesn't seem that Christian societies denigrate into the chaos that nihilistic societies do as rapidly and to the scale that they do. In just that 100 years, the hundreds of millions of people who died due to the fact that these societies had fallen into sort of a nihilistic state. Definitely have been atrocities committed in the name of Christianity, but I don't think on the scale that we saw in the 20th century. I mean, the more you dig into the 20th century, the more horrible things you see that happen. Even if you just take one event like the rape in Nanjing, it's millions, hundreds of millions of people being murdered for no reason. And again, if there's no moral system outside of man, and man can create his own moral system, well, who is to say what's right or wrong then? Who's to say that Raskolnikov wasn't right in murdering the 2 characters in Crime and Punishment? Who's to say, I mean, you name any crime you want, who's to say that that's right or wrong? You could say the state has the power to do that. But again, if the state has the power to do that, then they have the power to say, wear the Star of David, go to a concentration camp, go to a gulag. They have the right to decide these things. So if you give the state or you give individual men the power to decide that, I think it creates a real nihilistic void that is just leads to atrocities. And that's what Dostoevsky's arguing, is that in the absence of God, we need to turn back to God, not that we can create our own value system.
Yeah, does he lay and beyond this idea of the Übermensch? Because it seems like, and I don't think that Nietzsche would have planned out any of this, but it seems like the void almost if it has to get filled, that it's your own personal, either the Übermensch or that in yourself, that your goals. Well, if you don't have the morality that killing is necessarily bad, or if killing is just and dying is just turning off a switch. And I think that opens up all sorts of things, that if you don't have the morality and let's get things done. Well, if we have to kill certain people, or if we have to stop growing crops in this certain region, or if we have to massively move people across the country and that kills a bunch of people, well, you got to break eggs to make an omelet, and that's what you do. And without that morality in place of something, it's almost natural that nihilism is going to come across.
Yeah, it opens the floodgates for really anything. If your own achievement and your own success and getting power is the ultimate goal, well, that's inevitably going to lead to lots of issues, right? And if you subscribe to this idea, it's almost a Darwinian idea, which again is another one presented around the same time, is this idea of the strong survive. So if you're strong and you can get power over the weak, that's to your benefit. And that logic follows if there is no God, right? If there is no God, there's no right or wrong. Well, yeah, but then you're opening the door for anything goes, because who's to say what's right or wrong at that point? We can try to create our own value system as a society, and we can try and, as Nietzsche thought, to look to Übermensch, the Übermensch to show us. But again, if man has no right or wrong, nothing greater than them, then who's to say what is right or wrong? I think if you believe in good and evil, which it's a lot easier to believe in evil than it is good, I think, and that can be seen throughout history. If you believe in one of them, you have to believe in both, right? Again, that's that Jungian idea of yin and yang. They both exist, right? And life, the joys of life are usually found somewhere in between. But if you dip your toe into Nietzschean ideology and nihilism, you can fall very quickly too far into evil, I think. Now, that's not to say everything Nietzsche puts forth is wrong. I mean, he does have some good critiques of Christianity and dogmatic Christianity and how it drifts away from what Jesus originally preached. And it becomes less of an emphasis on the principles and the love and the faith and the hope, and it becomes much more of a ideology that you adhere to. It becomes much more legalistic, right? We see that in the church a lot. You do X, Y, and Z, you get to heaven. Well, that's not how it works, because none of us can ever do X, Y, and Z. So he does have some solid critiques of Christianity. So you can't throw out the baby with the bathwater. Not everything he says is wrong, but I do think that overall, this idea that man can create his own value system is just something we've seen throughout history is not something that works. And you can argue against that. People love to do the same thing with Marx and his ideas. They love to say, well, we've never had a pure communist state. We never have had this happen or this. I think fundamentally, communism presents the same problems that Nietzschean ideas do as well. It's this idea of you're removing the state. You're trying to make man the superior being. You're putting him above all else. And when we see that, society seems to denigrate into chaos very rapidly.
It's interesting. Studying the Christianity and the papacy, you can kind of see where it fits into this ideal that when the church really fails, it's when it turns towards nihilism and doesn't live up by its own value system. And really, in any of the societies that were nominally based in Christianity, with slavery and with those sorts of things, it's when they turn their backs on a value system. And wherever you get your value system, if you turn your back from that, that's when you're going to have the nihilism, and it becomes much more easy to do atrocities and that sort of thing.
Yeah, nihilism can creep in very quickly. Nietzsche goes on in some of the quotes I was having, and he says, "It is in one particular interpretation, the Christian moral one, that nihilism is rooted. The end of Christianity at the hands of its own morality, which cannot be replaced, which turns against the Christian God. The sense of truthfulness, highly developed by Christianity, is nauseated by the falseness and mendaciousness of all Christian interpretations of the world and of history. Rebound from God is the truth. To the fanatical faith, all is false, an act of Buddhism." So Nietzsche, the church does denigrate into a sort of nihilism, but they don't try to answer nihilism with man, but they don't answer it with God, like Dostoevsky wanted. They're somewhere in between where they're seeking truth almost above all else. What's true? And we see so many splits in the Christian church because of that, right? So many different denominations and arguments over little things. And instead of placing God as the center and being the main focus and the main answer to nihilism, they do kind of turn to own human wisdom, right? Something the Bible advises against, not to seek your own wisdom. And that definitely does have impacts on the Christian church and on some of the atrocities that were committed in the name of the church. And that's what Nietzsche was rightly pointing out, was that, look, you guys, you're not putting God first. He's not the center of your worldview right now and your moral structure. You're more focused on what's true. You're more focused on truth than on Jesus and on God. And I think you rightly pointed out that when the church loses sight of that, it does denigrate into its own sort of nihilism. And yeah, we see things like being able to, try to, in some sense, justify slavery in the name of God, which is, if you have a true understanding of the Christian faith, that's not something that, is being condoned at all. But when you turn to your own human wisdom, again, a Nietzschean idea, and the church is guilty of it too, you fall into nihilism, and we see these horrible atrocities being committed.
Steve here. We are a member of the Parthenon Podcast Network, featuring great shows like Scott Rank's History Unplugged podcast and other great podcasts. Go to parthenonpodcast.com to learn more. And here is a quick word from our sponsors. It also, if you want to build a new moral framework, it's really hard to do that from scratch. Yes. And there's going to be a lot of problems along the way. And maybe the early 20th century shows that building it from scratch is almost an impossible thing to do when you're not building off of something else. And with all its foibles of organized religion, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, whatever, they have those ideas of morality baked into them. And maybe people have an internal morality, but if there's no systems to build onto, there's a lot of problems that can come when you're just trying to go from scratch.
Yeah. And again, that's really what Nietzsche and Dostoevsky and a lot of those great thinkers were concerned with, is we've had our society based on this in human society for so long. The monotheistic faiths. And even if you look at some of the, like the Mesopotamian and Egyptian religions as well, they're very similar, like Marduk and these stories of creation. They're very similar to biblical Judeo-Christian accounts of creation. So they're different in a sense, yes, but their value structures are still, fairly similar. And for so long, human society has been built on these ideas. And it goes back to the ideas of Carl Jung, which is chaos and order. How much order do we need to have in society, but how much chaos do we need to have too? Again, it's typically somewhere in between. We can't have too much order and too much chaos. And I think the Enlightenment and the shift away from the order of the church, perhaps we had too much of it to an extent, and people got a bad taste in their mouth. But they started to turn too much to chaos, too much to, well, we can create whatever we want. We can create our own value system. We can create new governments. We can do this, this, and this. Well, we saw that didn't really work. So there's a balance between keeping our old traditions and exploring into the unknown, into the feminine, this archetypal unknown, this unexplored territory. But we don't want to venture too far into that and get rid of all the order that we have. And Dostoevsky was trying to tell us, let's go back to the order that we had because we veered too far away from it. So you don't want to veer too far off that path because, again, chaos can very quickly turn into nihilism, and nihilism can turn to just horrible, horrible things taking place.
Shifting it over to, you're an American history guy, and hopefully in a future episode, we'll talk a little bit more about the Civil War. But we look at some of these ideas in American history of the Trail of Tears, and they almost seem, and it's slavery in the United States, and it almost seems like a proto nihilism creeping in.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think? Nominally, everybody in the U.S. at that time was Christian, but these ideas of brutally enslaving people, and that was happening all over the New World, but it was pretty bad here in the U.S. And then something like the Trail of Tears, this mass movement that really presaged things like the Assyrian Holocaust and the Holocaust in Germany and the Holocaust of Armenian people. What do you think was going on in the U.S. at that time that kind of allowed people to say, hey, let's just do these things that were really brutal?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And I would argue similarly to what happens in Europe in the 20th century is that the state starts to become more powerful. And not necessarily that doesn't mean the church isn't there, but people start putting more faith in the state. They start putting more faith in the government, this idea of manifest destiny. I'm reading an excellent book right now, if I can remember the exact title of it. It's on the Mexican-American War, and it's a quote from Ulysses S. Grant, A Wicked War, that's what it's called. And they talk about Polk and how he really just instigates this war because he wants Oregon. I mean, he wants California. He wants the southwestern states. Oregon was also going on at the same time with the British. But this idea of manifest destiny, that America deserves this because America's great, because the state is superior to all. When you start to replace the state or replace God with a state or with an individual, you start to see this. When we put too much faith in the state and too much faith in man, we denigrate into nihilism, and we get things like the Trail of Tears, like we talked about. It's very easy to justify something when you remove God from the equation. And when the state becomes more powerful and they start to say, well, this group is another, Jews in Nazi Germany, Native Americans in America. And when you paint that group as another and as less than, and you remove God from the equation, or you twist his words and you start to rely on human wisdom, then you can, start to justify these things that went on in America. So I think there was too much emphasis being put on the state and on the government and on America, on American greatness. And again, that reflects on the greatness of man, because if you say, well, we created this as men and it's pretty awesome, then we must be pretty great. So what we say, should be followed. And then you start to twist God's words. And when you start to twist God's words and relying on your human wisdom and human interpretation, really anything starts to go at that point. And then we end up with these horrible things like chattel slavery, the Trail of Tears, even the war with Mexico. That was purely Polk's greedy heart at play. And Mexico did nothing to provoke that war that Polk hadn't done to them first. So I really think it's this sense of putting too much faith in man and too much faith in the government, which is what was going on in Europe with the Enlightenment. We started to put too much faith in man's reasoning, man's thinking, man's rationality. And when we do that, we make ourselves like little pseudo gods. The problem is we're not. At least as far as I know, there's none. So then these horrible atrocities can take place.
The Mexican-American War is one that really, I learned the school book version, probably even more than that, doing some different episodes on my other podcast. But we visited Mexico City, and it never really hit me until I saw this monument that they had set up to a bunch of kids. I think they were teenagers who got killed defending, I think it was Chapultepec Castle, but it might not have been. But just beating up on the Mexicans for no real reason, more than just to beat up on them. And in a way, based on what you've described here, you could say that that's living to your own morality, and that I can beat somebody up, let's do it, and then I'm the better for it, but with no morality involved in it. That's a scary thing to think about.
Yeah, it's that Nietzschean idea of power. Power is good. What's good for you is good. Because for Polk, he wanted more power. He wanted that land, and he was going to get it no matter what. And if you look at other politicians at the time, Whig politicians, Henry Clay, Lincoln, they weren't even concerned with Mexico. It wasn't even a blip on their radar until Polk started to, and the Democratic Party really started to rile this sense of war up, and really started to convince people that this was good for us. This is our destiny, right? This is, and they really just created this swell of public resentment for Mexico that wasn't even there in the first place. It was something that in 1841, 42, 43, Polk or any of the Whigs, Clay or any of the Whigs wouldn't have even thought about or worried about. And again, it's man turning to his own devices and saying what's right or wrong. Because to Polk, that was what was right. That's what he wanted. It was power. It was more power for America. America deserved it because we were more powerful than Mexico. And again, it's that social Darwinian idea of I'm more strong, I'm more powerful, so I can take what I want. I can basically create my reality, in a sense.
And to flip it kind of on its head, the North and Abraham Lincoln, from my understanding, he wasn't super mega religious Christian, but the whole idea of the North, it kind of starts off as a practical where Lincoln wants to just keep the Union together, but then it turns into a crusade of sorts. Do you think that that's maybe the flip side of Nietzsche, that people they created their morality, that there's almost no cost that would be too great to finally end slavery, even though going into the war, ending slavery wasn't the main objective of the North?
Oh, definitely. Because if you look at it from a purely, beneficial standpoint, the American people, and not only the American people, the people of Europe, of Britain, right, who industrialized this first, they're very reliant on Southern cotton. And Southern cotton being king and being so cheap, that benefits them, right? Because we can make our clothes cheaper, our textiles, and we can sell them for a bigger profit margin. So from that perspective, even though slavery wasn't taking place in the northern states, they were benefiting from it greatly. And from a Nietzschean perspective, that gives you more power. You're benefiting from it. So why get rid of it, right? And it is interesting because until it really becomes a crusade for the abolition of slavery, the North seems to struggle. And something that Dr. Hartman and I talked about is that in the West, early on in the war, we see the Union doing very well. You have Forts Henry and Donelson falling quickly to Ulysses S. Grant. The victory at Shiloh and the capture of Vicksburg. So Grant's doing well out west, but part of the reason for that, I believe, I don't know if I'll remember the exact, like the 48ers or something. There was a group of soldiers out there, and they were stoutly abolitionists, really, totally anti-slavery. And so they seem to fare better in the West. Now, part of that could be leadership, right? You have Ulysses S. Grant, who will eventually win the war for the North, but you also have the individual soldier who's fighting. And when they care about slavery being abolished, they seem to fare much better than they do in the Eastern theater of the war. Early on, you have First Bull Run, which is a disaster for the North. You have Second Bull Run, where Pope gets whipped again by Bobby Lee. You have Chancellorsville. Fredericksburg's the disaster, utter disaster for the North. And it's not till Gettysburg that we see a shift. We see a Union victory, but even at that, Lincoln was still upset because it wasn't. There was no pursuing the army in Northern Virginia. They get away to fight another day. So I do think when it becomes this a greater cause than just Union, than just mankind, than just something man's created, it does take on a different a meaning for the soldiers. Because again, if you're going to go give your life up for something, why would you fight to end slavery if you're benefiting from it, if it's not morally wrong? And I think we can all agree that slavery is morally wrong, right? But for us to reach that point, there has to be a reason that it's wrong, right? And that cannot come from us. We can't just say it's because, well, you're forcing someone to do something without paying them. Because from a Nietzschean perspective, that gives me power. That benefits me. So why would I end it? But from a Christian, from the church's perspective, it's wrong because God says it's morally wrong. And I believe that there has to be a higher power to tell us what's right or wrong. Because again, if it wasn't morally wrong, there was no real reason to end slavery in the American South.
Steve here again with a quick word from our sponsors. You have your podcast, the Civil War Center, and looking at it, it's quite different than a lot of the other podcasts out there on the Civil War. Do you think maybe your interest in philosophy kind of guides you to look at the Civil War in a different way than just strictly battles and numbers and 10-pound cannons and sort of the technicalities of the war, and maybe look at it from a more philosophical perspective?
Yeah, that's a good point, because I haven't thought about that, but I'm sure it does. I really like to try to tackle questions that are maybe unanswerable, that are maybe haven't been asked before. So there's 20,000 books, maybe more than on the Civil War. There's how many thousands, hundreds that come out every year. Most of the chessboard moves of the battlefield have been written and have been looked at. So I do like to try to look at it from a different perspective. And you've mentioned my interview with Dr. Hartman. Even that was something completely fresh. And I had a lot of people comment on that saying, I've never thought about Marx and the Civil War. That never came to my mind. So I like to try to get those perspectives that haven't been looked at. But yeah, also looking at it from more of a philosophical outside perspective. I do try to tie those things in because, how long have we been talking for? If the last hour of me going on about Nietzsche hasn't shown that I'm passionate about it, I love to study it. So if I can tie it in, I try to. It's also funny you mentioned that. I wrote one article for the Civil War Center website where I look at the Civil War from Carl Jung's perspective. And I think it's something that history can be looked at that people don't. His idea of archetypes are these ideas of things that every human cross culture can understand, like birth, death, marriage, dragons, right? Like, why do we watch a movie with a dragon and it makes sense to us? Because dragons aren't real. We've never seen a dragon, right? But we watch these stories and they make sense to us because they follow an archetypal pattern. You have a hero. The biblical narrative does it. Moses is a great example, how he leads the people out of slavery into the wilderness. The wilderness is a great archetypal imagery. The Old Testament's filled with it. If anyone's interested, I have been posting a lot on Genesis and on the archetypal imagery in Genesis. But I wrote an article on the Civil War and how it follows that psychological pattern where you have Ulysses S. Grant, who's the hero, really. In the sense, and he has to go through the wilderness. He has to develop. He has to mature. You have the good king, the wise king in Abraham Lincoln. You have the evil king in Jefferson Davis. And I relate it to the Lion King because the Lion King's very archetypal. Simba's the hero. Mufasa's the wise king. Scar's the evil king. That's why Disney movies are so popular, is because they follow this archetypal imagery. And that's something that Jung put forth. So it is something that I definitely tie in, this philosophical psychoanalysis. I definitely try to tie it into history as much as I can.
looking at the Civil War, it really how many times these stories they even get shoehorned in as the hero's journey and the archetypical story, like the movie and the book Gods and Generals. It literally turns them into gods, and like men of gods of war, these people. And I think it's very fascinating to look at it, why people would make the narrative like that, to take human beings who had their ups and their downs and putting them into this whole narrative scope of the hero's journey and the Union style. It's fascinating that we need to do that as human beings. It's like baked in.
Yeah, it's why we love Star Wars or Harry Potter, or there's a reason that millions of little kids will read a 100 to 600 page long book, because if you gave them, I got a book sitting here, if I gave a little kid this one here, they're not going to read it. This is Maps of Meaning. It's a psychology book, but you give them Harry Potter and they're going to read it. They want to watch Disney movies. And even as adults, we enjoy these things. And there's definitely a reason for that. And it's like you said, it's because it's baked into us almost as humans. We understand these things. If you look back at ancient societies, they have the same archetypal imagery. Like I was saying, the Judeo-Christian tradition, the Muslim tradition, which is tied in these monotheistic faiths, they also have a lot of the same imagery as the polytheistic faiths. A lot of the same, flood narratives is a common one we see. The idea of the hero dying and rising again, Jesus, Marduk, we see a lot of the same imagery. And that's something because as human beings, it's been ingrained in us and in our society. So we understand these stories much better when they're told that way. And I do think history tends to fall into that sort of pattern. And then when we tell history, if we want to tell it well, we tweak it a little bit to fit that pattern because it's what humans like.
It really, and if you read a book, if you read a novel, or you even see a story that doesn't fit into that, it's jarring. I read a book series a while ago, The Three Body Problem, and it doesn't fit that at all. And it was almost, I read the entire series, but it almost felt like torture reading the book, that it didn't have a hero's journey. The hero doesn't have a triumph at the end. It's just kind of stuff that happens and then it's over.
Yeah, I think the movie that I saw that was the most jarring recently, the story was Endgame, or not Endgame, was Infinity War by Marvel. And that one was so popular because the ending is like not what you would expect. The bad guy loses, right? And that's jarring to everybody. Everyone walked out of the theater like, wait a second, the Avengers didn't win. Spoiler alert, I guess, if someone hasn't seen it. But if you haven't seen it at this point, I don't think you will, right? But everybody was like, you leave with this like weird sense of there's no finality to it. Because you're like, well, that can't be the end. It's almost like if you listen to music, and we have chord progressions in music. And we like to end on the root note because it's final. That's why like one of the most famous chord progressions is a 1-4-5, because when you get to 5, it builds up all this tension and it's kind of uneasy. And then you go back to the 1 because it resolves it all. And it's the same thing in storytelling. And when you end on a 5 and you never go back to the 1, you're left feeling like, well, that was kind of weird. Like, something feels off about that because we're just so used to these stories where we do have a hero and he has to mature. He has to face a dragon in some archetypal sense because the dragon guards the gold. The dragon guards the virgin, the princess, right? So in order to get your reward, you have to go through the dragon. And these are archetypal stories. Even in Shrek, right? There's a dragon and a princess in a tower. So even in like the silliest example, we still have this imagery because we understand it in a deep sense.
I had a great time talking to you. I think people will definitely want to listen to your podcast and learn more. Where can they find out more about your show and, where to get to hear what you're talking about?
Yeah. So if they want to listen to the show, it is on all streaming platforms. You can search the Civil War Center podcast. It'll have a little picture of Ulysses S. Grant as the cover picture. The last episode we put out was on Stones River, which was a battle episode. But yeah, it's kind of all over the place, like you mentioned. We talk about books, new books that have come out, talk about battles, we talk about, every aspect of the Civil War. So you guys can check that out. I write as well, and have a few other authors who write for me on the civilwarcenter.com. So it's the same name, the civilwarcenter.com. And you can go there and check out, we have blogs on all different kinds of aspects of the war, battles, how the Confederacy got their weapons, on Ulysses S. Grant's birthday. We have all kinds of stuff over there. So anything relating to the Civil War. And yeah, it's kind of the two main things that we're working on right now. So people can check those out.
I want to thank you so much for coming on, and we will definitely be talking about some issues with the Civil War. And I think there's a lot to talk about. I'm a big fan of philosophy, and I like to talk with people who know philosophy and not just talk about it like me.
I like to think I know something about it, as much as we can ever know, right? It's kind of out there, but yeah, there's always people and thoughts that can be explored. So it was a great time getting to share some of that with you.